they have loved and cared for her. I would never want to try to hurt them in any way or take over their role, but I would want to help her to become a whole person if she has trouble accepting what has happened to her. Things shouldn't be so secretive. That's what makes them seem horrible.
Thank you for staying with us, and I wanted to thank you again for being with us tonight. Well, you heard a couple of different perspectives there. One woman saying, you know, the last thing I want is to have this unearthed and go back to that point in my life that I'd like to be closed and done with. And someone else saying, well, actually, you know, I'd like to be available should my child ever wish to learn more. Do you, I imagine in your counseling and people who contact you, you still come across women who, in fact, don't wish to be, have continuing, ongoing contact.
We do. And I respect their decision if that's what they choose to do. What I try to do if someone expresses that idea is to at least point out to them, you know, what are the possibilities, you know, the other way, that maybe they might want to look at what some of the advantages are of keeping in touch with the adoptive parents. But if they're absolutely adamant about it, then I respect that, and I feel that it's really their decision.
Well, doesn't that, some of that go back to the belief about people who are having children out of wedlock? I mean, though, particularly in California, you know, that seems to be more and more, you know, we're okay with that. But there's still parts of the country where there's still a great deal of shame attached to that, I would imagine.
I think there's a distinction between open records issues and people having ongoing contact, because you can know the identity of someone and still not contact that person. And I think a lot of times in our experience, people, let's say the adoptive parents may meet the birth parents, and if the birth parents don't want to be contacted, they won't contact each other, but they'll still know who they are. And the children, when they become adults, may ask their parents questions, and then it becomes a judgment call. We rarely find birth parents who say, I absolutely don't want anyone to know my identity later on. That's a very unusual way of feeling. Typically, the people who made that decision years ago and made a deal, in effect, with an adoption agency to keep their identity secret are very fearful now that that deal will be undone if the laws are changed. And it's a very, very dicey issue, because on the one hand, the child may have some rights to know things, and on the other hand, there's this agreement that caused the parent to place the child. And these issues come up all the time.
What is, Mark, what is the law at this point about the records?
At this point, records are not open.
Okay.
The way people find their birth parents' identities are, as I say, often in open adoptions, their own adoptive parents will know the identity of the parents. But they can't just go into a courthouse and get the records opened up. There are people who do try to help them find their parents and break through the secrecy. I'm not one of them, but there are people who call themselves search consultants who do that. And I guess I have very mixed feelings about the whole rightness and wrongness of it. I guess on the one hand, I feel a child has a very natural curiosity in wanting to know who created them. And I do think that birth parents are parents, not just adoptive parents. Adopted kids really have 4 parents.
Okay. That's an interesting point of view. Can you say a little more about that? I mean, how you came to that decision?
Well, I think, you know, there's been this ongoing question of whether a person is more a product of his or her heredity or environment, nature, nurture, that kind of thing. And certainly before I was an adoptive parent, I think I was much more of a believer that the environment was very, very important and the heredity was relatively unimportant. And I think I've changed that view to a certain extent, having lived it, and seen that children do really inherit a lot of things from their parents beyond just their physical attributes. Things like temperament, I think, are very much inherited to a certain extent. I think it's very nice if adoptive parents can like the birth parents, because there's a pretty good chance then they'll like the child.
That's right.
And the converse is probably true as well. And so I think that if I'm an adopted person, which I'm not, I'd be curious to know, well, how did I become this way?
Yes.
And whether that doesn't necessarily require meeting the people, but at least knowing as much as possible. Certainly, I can tell you our son wanted to meet his birth parents when he was 16, and he asked if he could do that. We had not made that agreement with the birth parents. We had kept in touch with them over the years. And we arranged for that to happen. And I can tell you, he's now 18. My sense is that he's very glad he did that.
Did you have any fear come up for you as parents about that? I mean, you had raised this child and put your heart and your life into this child, and how was that for you to have him make that request?
Well, it was a little scary, but I think because we somehow had faith in him as our child and us as parents, and we did know his birth parents. We just decided that it was the right thing to do for him, and that whatever fears we had, we were willing to put them aside, and that ultimately, if we looked at the thing as a whole, it was really the right thing to do, and we're glad we did it. We really are, but it was not without its, some scary moments.
Oh, I'm sure.
I think one of the things I've also learned is that we don't own our children. We borrow them.
There you go.
And they grow up anyway. We also have a biological child, and she's almost 18. And what happens at 18? They become adults on some level, and you either have them or you don't in terms of the emotional relationship, I think.
That's true.
And I think with adopted children, parents have a little advantage in that they don't expect the children to necessarily be mirror images of themselves. And when they aren't, they're not disappointed. Whereas with biological children, sometimes I think parents, when their children aren't just like them, have a hard time with that.
Yeah.
Well, when you're an adoptive parent, you sort of expect that.
And in fact, I imagine there's an element of curiosity and
Absolutely.
surprise. How is this child going to turn out?
Well, we have 3 children from 6 different parents, so our lives are very interesting.
Very interesting.
But I think for me, it was very nice to meet the birth mothers, because it did give me some sense of what my children were going to be like. And in fact, there are some ways that they are like them, and so it kind of helped us in raising them to have a little insight, and maybe to gear them towards certain interests and certain particular things.
That's a good point in terms of talents, things they
Yes.
may have inherited. Okay.
We've taken a different view as to what parenting is from what maybe we would have had if we had not been adoptive parents. I don't think we really expected the children to look like us or be like us or have our interests, and as you said, it's interesting because sometimes they get into things that are very different from ours. I think that's true with when you have biological children as well, but it feels harder somehow to accept, I think, for some biological parents, that their children don't want to be just like their parents.
That's right.
We've often said rather than mold them, we watch them unfold.
Which I think is the truth anyway.
Yes.
Actually. I think you're right about that. There's a little bit of ego distance, I would guess, then, in that case with adopted children. Now, you mentioned birth parents. Do you have contact with the birth fathers as well?
It depends on the circumstances. The birth mother is the only one who's always around because she's pregnant.
That's right.
But, or has just had the baby. But in many cases, birth fathers are involved, not most, but many, and certainly they're welcomed by our clients. In our son's case, his birth parents are married to each other now,
Okay.
although they were only 15 when he was born. So when it came time for him to say he wanted to meet them, of course he knew this, so it was a very easy package to put together. We also brought their 2 children along. They had 2 little girls, and so he got to meet his full-blooded siblings.
Wow.
So he's got 4 sisters.
Growth of a family. That must be fun for him in a way. Really.
It was. It
Yeah.
was.
So do the birth fathers, what kind of rights do they have in this process, if any? I don't know.
Oh, they have lots of rights. Husbands or men who live with the child have the same rights as the mother, basically, to veto an adoption.
Ah, okay.
Other fathers have the right to bring a lawsuit to establish paternity and seek custody, but it's not an absolute right to win.
Okay.
And one of the things which the media has seemed, I think, to exaggerate, not this particular media, but the news media, is controversy in adoption. Whenever there's a father wanting to get his child back, or a mother wanting to get her child back, or anything tragic, that attracts the news people. And there's a tendency to see anything like that as a trend, when indeed, in our experience, it is not. It's the rarest of cases where a birth father opposes an adoption and the matter ever gets to a court.
Okay, so in terms of the process, though, if you know who the birth father is, he needs to also sign in terms of relinquishment?
No, because he's not always available.
Okay,
The mother may know his name and not know where he is.
okay.
Or he may be someone who says, I don't want to sign anything, but I don't oppose the adoption. That's fine. He has a right to be given notice if he can be found, served with a paper that says, if you object, you do something.
Okay.
And he's got 30 days from the date he's served. And then there are some fellows who we're not exactly sure who they are.
Yes.
Because for whatever reason the mother doesn't know.
Okay.
And those adoptions still happen.
Okay.
The child needs to have a home, and the law tries to facilitate that.
So the law then is slanted in terms of what's best for this child.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's in my mind the way the law needs to be. I know frequently the law is not always focused on equitably, or it feels that way to people, but I'm glad to hear that about the children anyway.
Children don't write the laws,
No.
and they don't even vote for the people who do. But fortunately, enough of those people are parents, so that, and children at one time in their own
That's
lives,
right.
so that they can understand that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to make it hard for people to adopt children.
Okay. So, and that brings me to another question I was going to ask you. I know that one of the things I've heard from people about adoption is the length of time. You know, that it may take years, and I know people have sometimes become discouraged by the time of waiting. In your experience, going through an independent route, what kind of time frame are you looking at?
Well, I mean, basically it takes as long as it takes a couple to find a birth mother.
Okay.
So it can happen in a really short time, or it could take a long time with not as good luck. We estimate that most of our clients who adopt find their babies within 6 months to a year and a half.
Okay.
That's just an estimate, you know, some shorter, some longer. But we have found that if people really want to succeed, it's possible.
Okay. And in terms of finance, is that, I know the other thing that I hear when I was talking about this show was, well, gee, you know, I think adoptions are really expensive, aren't they? You know, and I actually don't know. I saw some breakdowns in some of the books I was reading, and you pointed out to me that they're rather dated. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what is the financial investment that couples make? I mean, do they pay for the pregnant mother's treatment and premarital, not premarital, but prenatal care and that sort of thing?
The usual financial arrangement is that they make it not cost the birth parents anything.
Okay.
So if there is uninsured medical care that needs to be paid for, the adoptive parents will pay for that, but frequently there is insurance. So there's quite a wide variation. We estimate, what do we estimate?
Yeah, we estimated, you know, we've had some adoptions as low as $5,000 and some as high as $15,000.
Okay. And really, I imagine we're going to need to close, but I imagine regardless of the cost, the reward is so much greater that it really doesn't, it's really worth it. That's what I'm hearing. Thank you for being with us this evening. Thank you for joining us. Tune in over the next few weeks as we look at violent children and we explore art therapy. I'm Mary Crocker Cook. Good night.